put your treasure in jars of clay. So take this heart, Lord, I'll be your vessel, this world to see your life in me. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Oh, I once was lost, but now I am found. Was blind, but now I see. Oh, I can see you now. Oh, I can see the love in your eyes, laying yourself down, raising up the broken to Oh, I can see you now. Oh, I can see the love in your eyes, laying yourself down, raising up the broken to life.
I've been excited to start this series because I don't know about you, but whenever I kind of start to see things kind of go haywire in my life, whether it's my own thinking or it's how I respond to things, I always know that I need to go back to grace. Because grace is what keeps us centered. It's what keeps us focused. It helps us stay in step with the Spirit. And we're going to talk a little bit in this series about what it looks like when we forget about grace. And things get really, really messed up in our life when we forget about God's grace. One of the things that I think is pretty apparent when it comes to speaking about God's grace is it's easy to see. It's easy to see God's grace in somebody's life, isn't it? Can y'all see that pretty easily? Like, I can see it on Sunday morning. I can see in the way people worship whether they have God's grace in them, right? If we're like this and we've got a scour and we're just kind of sitting here just waiting for 12 o'clock to roll around, I don't think you've ever experienced it, right? Grace can get ugly when it gets missed. And that's the reason our theme verse that we're going to be looking at, or we're just going to touch on for the next 4 or 5 weeks, is Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15, where the author of Hebrews says, "See to it that no one misses the grace of God." And then that's been my prayer as of late as the pastor of this church. Because think about the tragedy that it would be that you could come and be a part of this church, be a part of this community, and come in and feel the love and the acceptance from all the people here. Maybe the not so good preaching, but miss the grace of God. And he says, I don't want you to miss it. And there's a lot of things in this life that you can miss out on and that you can forget and that you can lose sight of. But he says, don't lose sight of this. Don't ever forget that it is by God's grace that you have a relationship with him. And that is because of that grace that you have any hope in this life at all. And so what we're going to do through this series is we're going to talk about our need for grace. We're going to talk about what grace does. But then this morning, we're going to talk about what happens when you remove grace. What happens when you replace grace in your Christian walk or you substitute it for something else? And what we're going to see this morning is that things turn toxic in our relationship with God. And like I said, I hope that each and every one of us, as we walk out of these doors this morning, well, it's like sometimes I get excited when I get up here and I'm going to preach something because sometimes I might think that my message, okay, this is maybe a little bit deeper than what people are expected to hear or maybe have heard in their life. And I'm gonna dig a little bit deeper into this subject. And this might be something new that you never heard before. This one, the word grace, right? Some of y'all been hearing about God's grace longer than I've been alive. And so it's not my hope this morning that I teach you anything new about grace, but that your appreciation for it is deepened and is strengthened. Because we've got to realize that each and every one of us have a need, have a desperate need for His grace. Now, when we talk about our need for grace, how do you talk about the majesty and the riches of God's grace without talking about what? Why do we have a need for grace? It's because we have sin, right? Like, I don't know how you can talk about grace and not talk about sin, right? I know some churches and some pastors do that, but you can't, you'll never recognize the riches of His grace until you realize the depravity of your sin. Like, you don't know how great He is able to save and to heal you unless you first recognize how broken you are in the first place. And you see, I think that's the reason why we can go along in our Christian life and miss grace, because we begin to miss our sin. The Bible talks about our sin problem. In Romans chapter 3, verse 23, Paul said, everyone has sinned, and we have all fall short of God's glorious standard. So sin is anything and everything that is not God's glory. It's the words we speak in vain. It is the thoughts we have that are not God-honoring. It is the actions that we take whenever we put ourselves first, whenever we are selfish, whenever we are greedy. But it is also the actions that we fail to make that don't show God's love and justice. And so the word there that we have to focus on is everyone. Everyone has sinned. That's you, that's me, that's your dog that, never listens. No. Every person with a soul, this is who that is. Everyone has sinned. Everyone has sinned. And this is where we come to understand the greatness of His grace. It's because we understand the gravity of our sin. His grace is so rich because our sin is so great. His grace is so great because our sin costs so much. You realize you don't know how something great is until you put it up against something else, right? Like, that's how you determine whether a basketball or a football team is great, is because what? They went up against all these other teams, and that manifested how great that team was. How do you recognize, how do you understand and appreciate the greatness of His grace if it is never put up against your sin? You see, another way we could say it is we cannot understand the greatness of His grace until we understand the greatness of our sin. And like I said, it's not hard to see when grace goes missing in a person's life, and we're going to talk about that more in the coming weeks, but when grace goes missing in a person's life, it is first and foremost because we have lost our sight for our need for it. Grace goes missing, it's because we lose sight of how much we need it. And the Bible discusses sin. It talks about sin kind of like this sickness, about this virus that we have. And I don't know, there's probably many of you that are like me, that whenever I get sick, I just like to deny it, right? I don't like to acknowledge it. Jessie will see my symptoms. She'll hear my symptoms. Maybe I'll keep her up all night coughing or something. And so then the next day, the script begins to be played out. She's going to tell me to take medicine. I'm going to tell her that I'm not sick, right? And she's like, "Well, you kept me up all night coughing." I'm like, "Well, that was, but I don't want to acknowledge that I'm sick, because if I acknowledge that I'm sick, then I have to do something about it, right? Then I should probably stay and rest, right? I should probably take some time off. I should probably take some medicine and get some fluids in me. And I don't want to acknowledge my sickness because then I have to deal with it. And I think that's the way a lot of us are with this sickness that is called sin. We don't want to acknowledge it because if we acknowledge that we are sick in that way, then we have to do something about it, right? Then there's got to be some treatment. Then there's got to be some medicine that is taken. And I've never found a medicine that tastes good, right? But the end result is good. And what we see here, that grace is the cure. Grace is the antidote for this sickness. But I want you to understand that grace as the cure for our sickness, it means nothing. It does nothing if we don't acknowledge that we are sick. It does nothing, right? I mean, we're never going to be healed of this sickness, of this sin that's in our life if we'd never acknowledged that we were sick in the first place. And if we don't acknowledge that we are sick in the first place, then what need do we have of grace? See, the Bible talks about this sickness, and he tells us where the sickness leads. In Romans chapter 6, verse 23, he says, the wages of sin is death. This isn't a cold that you'll get over in 2 weeks. This is not something that you're going to deal with for, a couple months, and then you'll just kind of, with time, you'll just work yourself out of. He says, no, this sickness, where it leads to, has only one prognosis, and that is death. That's where it leads. And he goes on to say in Romans chapter 5, verse 12, he says, when Adam sinned, talking about where this sickness started, he says, when Adam sinned, not this Adam, the first Adam, sin entered the world. And Adam's sin brought death, so death spread to everyone, for everyone sinned. And so it all started with Adam. And the Bible talks about sin as being this infection that first started with Adam. And because he sinned, now we have all been infected. We've all been contaminated with this sickness. And it's a sickness that leads to death. This way, the outcome of sin, of this sickness, has always been death. You remember God told Adam in the garden, he said, all the trees in the garden you can eat, but that one that's in the middle, don't eat it, because what's going to happen in the day that you eat of it? You will surely die. You will surely die. The prophets through the whole Old Testament, they cried out, what? That the soul that sins, it will die. You see, because our God is a holy God, and because he is just, and because he is righteous, and because he is set apart from sin, he hates sin. We got to realize this. He hates sin wherever and whoever he finds it in. I think for a lot of us, we've been going to church for a while, and we don't think our sin is as bad as somebody else's who doesn't go to church. Let me tell you something. It's worse in you than it is in the person out there. Because you know better. Because you know God's word. You had his light shine upon you. And that is the outcome of this sickness, is that sin leads to death. It will not lead you anywhere else. It will not lead you to happiness. It will not lead you to joy or satisfaction or contentment. As much as the enemy would like for us to believe that if we just go outside of God's boundaries or go apart from God's will, that those things are going to become true, he says no. Because of Adam, and because of his sin, and because we sin, we all have death coming for us. But then Paul, he introduces this word grace into the scenario. And he says in verse 15, he says, for the sin of one man, Adam, brought death to many. Now these are the words I want you to focus on. But even greater than what? Than Adam's sin. Even greater is God's wonderful grace and his gift of forgiveness to many through this other man, Jesus Christ. So Paul is saying, look, your sin is great. There's no denying that. But he says, let me tell you something that's greater than your sin, and that is the wonderful grace of God. And you see, when we understand the greatness of grace, that word makes all the difference in our life. Because that word, grace, it gives us freedom. That no matter what we've done, no matter how far away that we've gone from God, that word grace gives us confidence and it gives us hope that it's not too late, that God is rich in mercy, and that if we will come to Him, the riches of His grace are more than enough to cover our sin. So he talks about our sin, but he says, when we talk about sin, he says, I want you to know what is much more than your sin, and that is grace. He continues talking about it in verse 16. He says, and the result of God's gracious gift, what is the result of sin? Death. But the result of God's gracious gift is very different from the result of that one man's sin. For Adam's sin led to condemnation, but God's free gift leads to our being made right with God. That's what grace does. Grace makes us right with our Heavenly Father, even though we are guilty of our sins. He goes on to say in verse 18, he says, yes, Adam's one sin brings condemnation for everyone, but Christ's one act of righteousness brings a right relationship with God and a new life for everyone. And that's what I don't want you to miss. That God's grace is greater than your sins, and it makes you right with God. But it not only just makes you right with God, justifies you, makes you right in His sight, but it gives you a whole new life. It gives you a second chance. It gives you another opportunity. Like we've been talking about on Wednesday nights about being born again. He makes all things new in our life. And so the reality of this morning is that everyone has sinned. But through the grace that is found in Jesus Christ, everyone can be made right with God. And I think this is where who we were before Christ has an impact. That do we truly understand what He saved us from? The apostle said the one who starts to get tangled up in sin is the one who is nearsighted. And he forgot what the Lord redeemed him from, what the Lord saved him from. And Martin Luther, reformer, he had this very simple quote. He said, to this day I have yet to get over my salvation. And what did he mean? That God would use somebody like me, that God would make me acceptable in His sight, because I know how wretched of a man I am. And you see, and when we lose sight of grace, things get ugly. And grace will gets missed in our life. Things become toxic. And I want to talk to you just for a few moments of what it means whenever we talk about God and we talk about the gospel, but if we leave grace out, you know what you get when you talk about God, you talk about Christ, and you leave grace out. You know what you get? You get religion. You get religion. And I don't like religion. I don't even like religious people. One of the things that aches at my heart more than anything is people who are religious. Because, if you read Matthew chapter 23, you'll see that Jesus didn't like religious people either, right? And I know for a long time, we'd say it is the Christian religion, okay? And so I don't want you to think that I'm okay, the last 1,900 years of our existence is, but religion is, well, let's define it. Religion is simply our attempt to earn God's favor by adhering to rules and to regulations. And so the idea here is, and I think this is, if you talk to most people and you ask them, okay, are you going to go to heaven or are you going to go to hell? And what will they do? Well, they'll most likely say, well, I'm a pretty good person, right? And what do they mean by that? Like, what does anybody mean when they say I'm a good person? What they mean is that if you were to get the scales out, right, and you were to put all my good works over here on this side and all my bad works over here on this side, this side would weigh more, right? My good would outweigh my bad. And nobody's good outweighs their bad. But that is what religion is. Religion says I can be made right in God's sight. I can earn his favor if I just keep these rules and I just keep these regulations. Like, my good acts, this is what religion really speaks and what it really teaches is my good acts is enough to cover my sin. That even though my sin is so great, I understand that. But you know what? If I just come to church and I just pay my tithes, and if I just dress the right way, and if I keep these rules and these rituals, then the good will outweigh the bad. And what I want you to understand is no. Religion is not greater than your sin. Religion is not greater than your sin. I don't care. You can be the most holy, set-apart person. You can cut your hair a certain length. You can wear special clothes. You can go. It's still not greater than your sin. There's only one thing that can take care of your sin, and Jesus did that for each and every one of us. Now, I came up with a little bit of this contrast to get us to understand the difference between what happens when religion is our focus and what happens when grace is our focus, okay? And so the key word for religion is to do. It's about what I do, right? It's about what I have done, and it's about what I can do. And really what is the cycle that I get caught up in? I'm just constantly trying to do more, right? I'm constantly trying to offset the balances, right? Like you have a day where you're stuck in traffic and you didn't do very good on your behavior and maybe on your words and on your speech. And so then what? You got to go serve at the homeless shelter for a couple hours to differentiate that balance, right? And so you're constantly in this cycle where you're burdened down with this pressure to do more good than bad. And like we've said, you can't do it. Not in the sight of a holy God. You can't outdo your sin. But the key word for grace is done. The key word for grace is done. It's not what you do, it's what's been done for you. It's not how good of a Christian you can be, but it's how great of a Savior you had that died on the cross for you and died for your sin. So with religion, it's due. With grace, it is done. The focus of religion is outward. You see this consistently when Jesus criticizes the spiritual leaders of his day. He would say things like, you honor me with your lips, but your hearts are far from me. Or he would say, yeah, you look good on the outside, but I know on the inside you're full of dead men's bones, right? He always had great compliments to help people along, right? But Jesus didn't like that. When there was this charade, when people would put on this mask and they would pretend to be something that they're not. And I don't care how good you are at religion. It always boils down to a charade. It's always about putting on a mask. It's always about the show that you're putting on in front of others, right? And I always crack up, being a pastor, and I don't take myself that seriously as a pastor, right? I don't want y'all calling me reverend. I don't even want you calling me pastor. I'd rather you call me Brother Adam. But I notice a difference when people come into my presence and they get real. I call it churchy. Okay, they get real churchy. And I had this one gentleman. He never talked like this before, but whenever he would be with me, he would always start using these and thous and ye's in his. And I said, okay, but he would always ramp up the spiritual, thermostat whenever. And that's what religion leads to. It's where it's about performance. Now the focus of grace is inward. The focus is on the heart. I might be messed up on the outside, but hopefully you're starting to see a little bit of what God is doing on the inside come out to the outside. But I don't sit here, I don't get up here and put on my three-piece suit and make y'all think that you've got some, spotless, brushed up pastor. Because each and every one of us are a work in progress. And that's I hope, because we realize and we recognize our need for His grace. The foundation of religion is rules, right? And what happens usually whenever we make the foundation rules, right? We've got some communities, we got some that call themselves Christians. And what happens when it's about rules? Well, you kind of start doing like the Jews did, right? I mean, they had 613 laws in the Old Testament. And if that wasn't enough, then they started adding on to those 613 laws to just make it that much simpler and easier, right? But that's what we start doing. Whenever the focus is on religion, we start making it about rules, and then we start saying, well, we'll go past and say, you know what, if you really are a Christian, I mean, if you're a super duper Christian, you'll not only follow these rules, these commands, but you'll also follow these as well. And that's where you start getting into legalism, where you start making it more about commands and about doing than the focus of the gospel and what's been done for us, okay? So the foundation of religion is rules, but the foundation of grace is relationship. And that means, I want you to understand this relationship, and we'll talk more about this as we go on. But that means that the foundation of our relationship with God is grace. Then that means that every time I sin or every time I make a mistake, that doesn't mean that my relationship with Him is up in the air. Now, do I need to confess and repent of that sin? Yeah. But me and my wife, whenever she drives me crazy and gets on my nerve, no, I'm just kidding. It's the other way around. Whenever I do that to her, the relationship isn't up in the air. And that's the same way it is with God. When we live, the foundation of our relationship is God's grace. We don't live in fear of losing that relationship unless we turn and walk away from Him. Now, this next one, the motivation for why we do stuff. The motivation for religion is shame, right? So religion will always try to control people by making them feel bad. Now, I'm going to be kind of careful here, okay? Because there's a difference. There's a huge difference between shame being our motivation. We feel bad about things, right? We feel bad for the things that we've already committed and already been forgiven of. There's a big difference between feeling bad with shame and feeling bad with conviction, okay? Feeling bad with shame, it makes you feel bad where you don't even want to come to God because of what you've done. When Adam and Eve, when they sinned in the garden, Adam didn't go run up to God and say, God, would you please forgive me, did he? No, he went and hid because he felt the shame of his sin. And so the shame of his sin told him to go hide, to go run away from God, right? But conviction isn't a good feeling either, but it's necessary. Whenever we are convicted, it feels bad. But conviction doesn't tell us to run away from God. Conviction tells us to run to God, right? But religion, motivation for religion, well, you're always going to have shame because guess what? You're never going to always measure up. Unless you, like we talked about Wednesday night, unless you compare yourself with Hitler or Jeffrey Dahmer, you're never going to measure up, right? So the motivation for religion is shame, but the motivation for grace is gratitude. You see, when I'm living out that relationship and I'm living for Christ, I can always tell when I start to miss grace. And that's when my gratitude goes down. That's when I start thinking other people owe me when they don't owe me anything at all. It's when I start putting expectations upon people that I have no business putting expectations upon them. You see, the children of Israel, those spiritual leaders, Pharisees, they were always putting standards on people that they themselves were not willing to meet. And why did they do that? Because they wanted to use shame as a way to control the people. But you see, what God has called us to, He has called us to live in recognition of what has been done for us. And because we recognize the great price that was paid for us, that should lead us into a motivation of gratitude, where we are grateful. We are grateful that we get to mow the church lawn, which, guys, I need some guys to mow up on the mowing lawn. We got a mower here. If you can help in that, be grateful, okay? That you're grateful that you get to do whatever He's called you to do because you realize how much has been paid for you. Now, what is the outcome? The outcome of religion is pride and guilt. That's always what you will get when religion is your foundation, because you're either going to sit around and you're going to be proud and you're going to compare yourself with other people and you're going to say, well, they're not as holy as me, they're not as righteous as me, they don't even go to church, and there's going to be this self-righteous pride that springs up in you, or you're going to think, I haven't done enough, and I need to do more. And so then there's going to be this guilt. But see, the outcome of grace is love. The outcome of grace is love. John said that we love Him. Why? Because He first loved us, right? See, when our focus is on His grace in our lives, we experience love. He did for us what we can never do for ourselves. And so the foundation of it is love, but the bottom line is that grace is greater than religion. So religious rule keeping does not deal with our sin condition. And it's not an effective treatment for the sickness that we have. But you see, to understand the significance of grace, it's not just to see our need for it and to see what happens when we miss it. And look, this is one of the things that's very hard as a preacher, as a teacher. Because grace is one of those things that you really can't know about until what? Until you have actually experienced it, right? I mean, I can give you some snazzy illustrations. We can we can get out our Bible dictionaries and put up a good definition up there, but you will not appreciate it until you've actually experienced it. You really can't teach anybody about grace until you've actually tasted it yourself, right? Y'all know my love for Chick-fil-A, right? And how you can't tell anybody about how good Chick-fil-A is unless you've had a chicken sandwich. And that is the same way it is with grace. And I think this is the reason why a lot of people don't witness and don't tell people about Jesus, because they haven't experienced it. But grace has to be experienced. It's interesting, Paul, he'll talk about grace like over 100 times in his letters. He'll talk about it over 100 times. You know how many times Jesus used the word grace? 0. He never used the word grace. You see, Paul is explaining and defining grace, but Jesus is the one who came and expressed that grace. So I want to give you just one example from John chapter 8. And instead of you turning there, I just want to tell you the story. Jesus is in a courtyard early in the morning. We don't know what he was teaching on, but it must have been pretty good because the people got there early in the morning to hear him talk. And so Jesus is in that courtyard, and he's teaching, and they're listening. And as he's in the middle of his lesson, this angry mob bursts through the doors, bursts through the gates. And everyone turns their attention, just like when somebody's cell phone goes off, everybody quits looking at me, and it's like, okay, who's the guilty culprit? Everybody's attention just focuses away from Jesus, and it comes onto this mob that is pushing this woman out into the center of all the people. Now, it's safe to say that this woman she's not covered. If she's covered, it's only a bed sheet. And she's shoved to the ground in front of Jesus into the dirt. And one of the spiritual leaders looks at Jesus and says this in John chapter 8. Says, "Teacher, This woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law tells us to stone such women. What do you say? And at first, he doesn't say anything. Like Jesus, he knows that this is a trap. So he begins to bend down and he begins to write in the dirt with his fingers. Many pastors speculate what he was writing. Probably the best one that I've ever heard is that he was writing the sins of the accusers there in the dirt. But we don't know. But one of the religious leaders says, Jesus, what would you do? The law tells us that we should stone her. What should we do? So they think that they've got Jesus in this trap, right? Because if he says, don't stone her, then they're going to say, well, you're going against the law. And if he does say stone her, to be in accordance with the law, then people will say, look, he just killed this woman. And Jesus, he stands up, and you know what he does. He says, well, if any of you is without sin, let him cast the first stone. And then he just goes back to writing in the dirt. And one by one, the stones get dropped, and the accusers leave. And Jesus is left alone with the woman, and Jesus looks at her. I want you to understand this. His eyes are not full of condemnation, and they're not full of judgment. But he looks at this woman and says, where are your accusers? Is there no one left? She said, no one. He says, neither do I condemn you. I want you to understand this. Because Jesus knows this woman. I mean, he's known her since he knitted her together in her mother's womb. Jesus knows the very number of hairs on this woman's head, and he says, is there no one left to condemn you? He says, neither do I condemn you. Go and leave your life of sin. Now, this is guilt. This is sin. She's caught in the act. The door is ripped open. She's pulled from the bed. There's no question about her guilt. It's the worst day of her life. Because the day she feared the most was the day that her secret would be found out. But her worst day, the worst day that she feared of ever experiencing, of ever coming to the light, is now going to become the best day in her life. Because her brokenness is going to meet with Jesus. And here's what we need to understand. When we talk about grace, we can talk about grace being greater than your religion, greater than religion, grace being greater than sin. But grace is also greater than your secret. His grace is greater than your secret. Because I think this woman's worst fear is that somebody would find out. And so she hides it, she covers it, she keeps it. And I don't know where you're at this morning. But maybe you have a secret. Maybe it's something that you keep from other people and you just live in denial of it. Maybe of your lust, of your greed, of your selfishness, of your jealousy. And you think that the worst thing that could happen is for it to be found out. Is it for it to be exposed? Now here's the thing that we have to understand. Those secrets are killing you. Those secrets are killing me. And our secret doesn't want to be found out. But the beautiful truth that we see here in this story is that when our secret is found out, that we realize that God's grace is greater than what we've been hiding. And that means you have to drag your secret kicking and screaming into the light. Because it does not want to be exposed. But this is what I want you to understand this morning. This is the whole message of grace, is don't live with it. Don't live with it anymore. I'm not saying you come up here and publicly declare it to all of us. I don't want that. we'd be here for a very long time, wouldn't we? But you must bring what is in the dark into the light. And you'll realize this beautiful truth that this woman came to know, and that God's grace is greater than what we hide. There's this book, it's called Post Secret. And I wouldn't recommend you to read it. It's pretty dark and pretty messed up, but it's written by a man named Frank Warren. And what Frank did was he took 3,000 postcards and he put them up in all these public places. And what the postcard said, it says, you're invited to anonymously contribute a secret to a group art project. He says, reveal anything that you want as long as it's true and it's never been shared with anyone. And so then he left these cards in these public places for people to fill out and send back in. Some of them were kind of funny. Some of them were kind of hilarious. Some of them were just pretty weird. But most of them that I read were just pretty sad. Like there's this one that said, I wish my father had forgiven me while he was still alive. Or this other one, sometimes I wish I was blind just so I wouldn't have to look at myself every day in the mirror. My husband doesn't know he's raising his best friend's child. When I sleep with my wife, I feel unfaithful to my lover. I haven't spoken to my dad in 10 years, and it kills me every day. I'm only happy when I buy things. But what was very interesting is the very last confession, the very last secret in this book said, I told all my secrets, and now I feel free. But you see, really, there is no freedom without grace. Without grace, we know where that sickness, that secret's going to lead. It leads not to freedom, but it leads to death. And that's the other thing that I think that Jesus, that we learn about grace and teaches us, is that grace is greater than shame. Grace is greater than our secret, but it's and what we try to hide, but grace is also greater than our shame. You remember, Jesus is left alone with this woman. She's humiliated and she's ashamed. But that's when he says to her, I don't condemn you either. Go and leave your life of sin. Now, we usually say, oh, see, he was telling her, don't you go back and commit adultery. Was that part of it? Yeah. But what was the command? You're set free. You're set free. You don't have to go back there. And I think we forget and we distort grace. And the whole message of grace is that we don't have to stay. We don't have to stay that way. We don't have to live with shame. We don't have to live with our secret. We don't have to live under the constant guilt and shame that our mistakes and our failures and our sin has made. And so my prayer is that we would encounter God's grace in such a way where it would become more than just this word that we can define. But because of his grace, we would have a story that we could tell. Can you tell a story of God's grace? Can you? Can you tell a story about how his grace took something which was broken, which was marred, which was just a disaster, and turned it into something beautiful, something that represents him, something that is made for his glory? And I pray that each and every one of us experience his grace in that way. There might be a preacher some of y'all heard. His name is Matt Chandler, and he tells this story. I'm going to tell you this story, and then we're going to pray. Matt Chandler, he tells this story about this time when he was in Bible college. And he was a freshman in Bible college, and there was this Christian concert that was happening in the city that he was going to college in. And so in his little Bible study that he had, he comes in and meets this woman whose name is Kim, and she's a single mom. She's like 19 years old. Okay. And so they go to this Christian concert kind of as a group, and Matt's sitting by Kim, and he's hoping that it'll be an encouragement to her, and that, it'll be another way to introduce her to the gospel. And so after the concert was over, they had a preacher that came out on stage, and he came out, and he was going to talk about sex. And he started getting up there and talking about statistics, STDs, and going on along this. And he takes out this rose, and you could tell, I mean, it's this beautiful rose. He smells it and says it smells so good. And he says, okay, he hands it to somebody down in the crowd, and he says, while I'm preaching, I want y'all to pass that rose around, okay? And so he starts going on, and he's being pretty forceful and pretty judgmental in his talk, and that rose is just being passed all the way around. And as he gets to the end of his message, he asks for the rose back up. And he shows the rose, and its petals are torn off, stem is kind of broken. And he says, now who would want this? It's been passed around, doesn't even smell like a rose, it's been broken. I mean, who would want this? Nobody would want this. And the pastor that was sitting there next to the single mom said, I just wanted to stand up and say, Jesus wants that rose. That's why Jesus came to buy that kind of rose. That he who knew no sin became sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. You see, that's the whole reason why Jesus came, was to make things new. To take that which had been broken and marred from the sin-cursed earth, and to give it new life. And that's the message of grace. That Jesus wants the broken rose, even if nobody else does. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer.